Welcome to the podcast of the Public Education Foundation.
I'm Zhan Okuda-Lim with the Leadership Institute of Nevada. I'm here with Dr. Rick Hess, the Senior Founding Fellow of the Leadership Institute and the Director of Education Policy Studies at the American Enterprise Institute. Rick, it's great to have you here today.
Hey, Zhan, good to be here with you, man.
Hey, Rick, let's talk about midterms. Let's talk about the election. Just happened pretty recently. You're there in Washington, you're there with AEI, you're traveling across the country seeing what's happening in education. What are you seeing in terms of what's going to happen with education post-midterms? What's on your mind right now?
In Washington, the idea of really being actively involved in K-12 education has already been in retreat. We saw that with the passage of the Every Student Succeeds Act a couple years ago.
Sure.
The Trump administration has mostly been focusing on promoting in K-12 school choice, and there hasn't been a lot of action in Washington, and there will continue not to be a lot of action. Across the nation, look, what you've seen is a shift from the stuff that was reformed for the last 20 years, testing, accountability, teacher evaluation. You've seen a shift away from that and towards much more talk about things like early childhood, career and technical education, and personalized learning.
Let's talk about that for a bit. Recently, you worked on an article looking at lessons from the reform era, from the Bush era, from the Obama era. What would you want to share? What are some of the key things that you learned from that experience?
So there's a bunch, yeah. I mean, any of your listeners want to check it out. A book out from Harvard this fall. It was called Bush-Obama School Reform Lessons Learned. So there's a lot. But a couple of key ones. One, when you move the center of gravity for anything to Washington, it has real repercussions on your ability to push reform in the states. One, if you really like George Bush, then having the Bush administration push your agenda is good, which tends to work in red states. In blue states, that turns out to not be so helpful. And vice versa with Obama. One of Common Core's big problems was it became increasingly seen as an Obama initiative rather than a state-up initiative. So one, in some sense, school reformers, should be appreciative that they've got much less leadership coming out of Washington because it lets them actually configure to the states they're working in. Second thing that is just always worth keeping in mind is once you start getting momentum on these reforms, it's really hard to course correct. And the more that momentum comes from Washington and from national organizations, the harder it is for folks at the state level to dig in their heels and say, that's not what we're trying to do, that's not what we mean. So again, there's trade-offs here. Having Washington lead the way can build you political capital, it can move things out of the way, but there's some real trade-offs that people often don't appreciate.
And let's dive a little bit deeper into that. You mentioned some of the more recent reforms like Race to the Top, reauthorization of the Elementary and Secondary Education Act, now the Every Student Succeeds Act, but we've seen states and local jurisdictions go through a couple rounds of these reforms in fairly recent memory. What should school systems do now under this new federal scheme where the control in many cases is back at that local and state level?
They should try to do the same things they should always try to do, which is ask hard questions about what makes sense, why are we doing the things we're doing. I mean, part of the problem is when local leaders start checking their brains at the door and saying, what do we have to do? That's not a recipe for serving anybody well.
It becomes more of a compliance task, a checklist. What are we just doing what's on that list?
Yeah. I mean, schools are incredibly intimate human places. It is hard to run great schools if you're asking, what are we allowed to do? The right question is always, what should we be doing?
What should we be doing, right? And on that point, recently at AEI, you talk about being wary of those who say they're innovators. If we have a new superintendent or a new leader coming into a new space and they say, I'm an innovator, I'm going to bring innovative ideas. You shared some caution about that. Share a little bit more about what you mean by that. What reservations should school leaders and local communities have?
We tend to use innovative as a positive term. Your listeners should think about last time they went in to buy a car. Mm-hmm. I sure hope they didn't say, hey, what's the most innovative car you have? You should ask if you're buying a car, hey, how about the gas mileage? How safe is this going to be for my kids? How good is the radio? Does it have Sirius? Now, cars getting safer and getting better mileage and getting better, satellite radio, those things are innovations.
Sure.
But innovations are what happens in the background. So one of the problems is it should never be, is somebody innovative? It should be, what are we trying to do? What problems and opportunities are they identifying? How concretely and sensibly can they talk about doing stuff to make the schools better? And whether or not that sounds innovative or the opposite of innovative should be the last thing on anybody's mind.
Ultimately, you ought to look at the fundamentals.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that if you're a college football fan and you look at programs that seem to win lots of games every year, they innovate some. They innovate in how they use players and how they do things. But a huge part of what they do is just they are really smart and thoughtful and disciplined about how do you do the basic stuff. The same is true with great symphonies. The same is true with great theater. The same is true with great lawyers and great doctors. The world makes a certain kind of sense in some ways. And one of the things that makes sense is when you do things carefully and well, good things happen.
Mm-hmm. And now, after the midterms, with what's happening now with power back in local school systems and in states, there can be this effort to get back to the fundamentals, but there's also this new push for increased voice from teachers, from other stakeholders in the community. Some of the work that you do here with our Leadership Institute, working with folks in the Clark County School District and across our state who participate in our program, is encouraging them to bust out of that cage, look beyond the actual or perceived barriers that they might face. And it sounds like an increasingly important thing to keep in mind now with what's happening in local jurisdictions and back in the states.
Yeah, I don't know that it's any more or less important. I mean, I think it's something that's always important. When I got into this stuff back in the 1990s, one of the problems was there was so little momentum behind reform, quote unquote, that a lot of our conversations just wound up being about things that didn't seem to create much opportunity to really make schools dramatically better. There was a lot of worrying about block scheduling. There were always calls for more spending. It wasn't clear to me that changing scheduling was going to create dramatic differences in learning. Mm-hmm. And spending more money, if you're not spending it wisely and well, seems more like a recipe for annoying taxpayers than for creating great schools. One of the interesting things of the last 20 years has been that you saw an explosion in energy and bandwidth among people who are outside of schools and systems, who are quote unquote reformers, and they brought certain things to the table. They bring a different perspective. They bring less attachment to the schools. That's because those strengths are the flip side of weaknesses. They Sure. are less familiar with what happens in schools because they're not in them. They're not as invested in schools because they're not part of the school system. So there's a strength here, but the strength of this outside perspective needs to be balanced, complemented, informed by people who actually do the work every day. And that part of, I think, why, we talk about Bush-Obama lessons learned, part of, I think, why so many of the Bush and Obama efforts wound up disappointing is because reformers got caught up in writing policy and in advocacy, and they were paying far too little attention to how this stuff was actually playing out in the real lives of students and teachers. And so I think when we talk about this resurgence of teacher voice, what we're really dealing with is we have overcorrected one way. I don't even know if it's an overcorrection. We got too caught up in policy and reform, and what we need is a much healthier balance. And I'm hoping that the kind of teacher leadership that we're promoting, the kind of teacher voice that you hear folks talk about, this is exactly that kind of missing half of the equation that we need.
You talk a little bit about this too in your new book, Letters to a Young Education Reformer, some of the lessons that you and other colleagues have learned having followed this last decade or so.
Yeah. No, I mean, this is what we're talking about is very much part of that. I've been doing this stuff close to 3 decades. What's interesting about education, because people are so passionate and so committed doing what they think is right, it's very easy to imagine that whatever we're doing is for the kids, and whatever folks who don't agree with me are doing is therefore anti-kid. And so you get reformers who, when teachers don't sign on to their big idea of the moment, decide teachers don't care enough about kids, and teachers see reformers coming up with things that seem goofy or ill thought, and they decide reformers must be declaring war on schools and must not care about kids. And one of the lessons I encourage young reformers to think about is maybe it's the case that in almost all of this stuff, everybody is right. We need to think differently about schooling. We need to think differently about how we ask schools to be responsible for serving kids well. We need to think differently about how schools do their business. But a huge amount of that thinking differently needs to be driven by people who actually understand and work in schools, rather than people who hang out at advocacy groups and have coffee with legislators.
So let's say I'm a school principal. We're in a new school year. It's after the election. I'm thinking about who the new policymakers will be here in Nevada, up in Carson City, folks who will be making education policy decisions. If I'm that principal or that teacher leader or someone in that position where I am at the intersection of being with students, being with kids, but also having to take direction from what's happening elsewhere, what should I be keeping in mind moving forward? How can I best get back to those fundamentals, thinking about how to best serve my kids, even with all the other things that might be happening around me?
And I think the key is always ask, what are opportunities for us to do better? I'm not crazy about talk of teacher leadership and teacher advocacy, because it too often means teachers wearing t-shirts on buses to go stand in rallies outside capitals. I don't know that actually leads to much real change in anybody's life. For me, empowering teachers, empowering leaders is about empowering them to do more of the stuff that they try to do every day for kids. So what are the things that are not working in a school? What are the things that are getting in a teacher's way, in a principal's way? What are decisions districts are making that don't make a lot of sense, that waste time, that waste energy, that are a distraction? What are those? What could we be doing better? And what is in the way when it comes to doing better? And I think if those are the questions that principals or teachers are asking, then it points them to the things that they care about, points them to opportunities that they think will make a difference for kids, and it focuses on solving problems instead of yelling at each other.
I think those are all great questions for teacher leaders, education leaders, policymakers to be keeping in mind here locally and in our state and throughout the country moving forward into the new calendar year. Hey, Rick, thanks so much for spending some time with me here at the Leadership Institute today. I really appreciate it.
Good to be with you, Zhan. Always a pleasure to be out.